welcome you all. There you go. It is my honor to welcome you all to this seminar of the Exeter Center for the Study of the Life Sciences at the University of Exeter. We are particularly delighted today to have our colleague, Professor Charbel El-Hani, joining us. And of course, it's sad that we cannot have you visit Exeter as we were planning to, Charbel, but it's fantastic that you could join us at least virtually. And it's a really great honor to have Charbel joining us today for many reasons. He is very well known as certainly the most international well-known, I would say, a philosopher of biology in Brazil, very active on several fronts. He is a professor at the Institute of Biology of the Federal University of Bahia in Salvador de Bahia. And he coordinates there the History, Philosophy, and Biology Teaching Laboratory. And I think this already says a lot about the intersection of interest that Charbel has brought forward in his work for all of his career, one of which is actually continuing to do research in biology and particularly conservation biology, but also do a lot of work in education and in engagement. And part of the work that he will present today pertains to this strand of his work. And it's just incredible. I mean, I've seen it myself in a visit I managed to do to Brazil last year before everything closed down. I was honored to take part on one of Charbel's expeditions, and I've seen firsthand some of the very many activities that he does in encouraging engagement of very different kinds of publics in Brazil with conservation efforts and with different parts of understandings of biology. And of course, the third strand of Charbel's work, which is the most relevant to us in a sense and the closely allied to Egenis, is the one that concerns the philosophy and history of biology. And in that context, Charbel has made many contributions, and most recently has become one of the torchbearers for the approach that tries to incorporate more global understandings of what it means to think about biology and do philosophy of biology, and doing a lot of efforts towards providing tools to decolonize our understanding of philosophy of science and philosophy of biology, which is all of these topics are of enormous interest to all Egenis members. And so it's just a delight to be able to welcome Charbel and to hear what he has to say about one of his latest research strands. Thank you, Charbel. You're muted. Sorry, I will.
First, let me, I need to open my window again because I did something wrong. I was about to close the, okay, now it is. Just 1 minute, please. So now you can see, yeah? So hide these things so that we can. So thank you, Sabina, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be talking to Egenis. It would be amazingly good to be there in presence, but we can do that. But it's a pleasure to join you all virtually. So my talk today will be about intercultural dialogue and learning across difference in traditional fishing communities using the partial overlaps methodology. And these fishing communities, they live in this very beautiful estuary that I show in this picture. So you are probably all very familiar with the fact that there has been in the literature a lot of debates about knowledge co-creation, knowledge integration, transdisciplinary, remote stakeholder approach, and a lot of frameworks to think about these issues too. And we have been, me and David Ludwig from Wageningen, we have been thinking about the philosophical questions related to the idea of dialoguing and integration between different knowledge systems. We published a paper in Journal of Ethnobiology this year discussing these philosophical questions, particularly focusing on our major interest, which is the relation between traditional ecological knowledge and academic ecological knowledge. Hereafter, I will talk about TEK and AEK. And we identify 4 challenges for talking about dialogue and integration between traditional and academic ecological knowledge. The first challenge is the epistemological challenge, stemming from the fact that traditional communities in academic science, they use different methods to produce and to validate knowledge. but we have also an ontological challenge that these traditional communities and academic scientists, they also use different frameworks to understand experience and to think of reality. And we have an ethical challenge in the sense that these epistemic and ontological commitments are interwoven with distant value systems. And finally, the political challenge that stakeholders like traditional communities and academic scientists they are often in very different power positions, and they have an equal force to defend their own epistemological, ontological, and ethical perspectives, both in power struggles and also in collaborative practices. And we propose as a way to advance in discussing these challenges what we call the partial overlaps framework. And this partial overlaps framework is built in contrast with full-fledged optimism and pessimism about knowledge integration. So for some authors, knowledge integration seems relatively easy. We have optimistic claims about knowledge integration, particularly in the field of conservation. And we think these optimistic claims tend to be aligned with philosophical universalism. If we see, for instance, this quotation by Berlin in 1996, where they argue that ethnobiological knowledge of traditional peoples conforms in many respects to basic scientific principles, we can see that the scientific principles are taken here as a kind of ruler based on which we can measure, we can check the knowledge of other communities. And this sounds like pointing in the direction of philosophical universalism. Pessimistic claims about knowledge integration, in turn, tend to be aligned with philosophical relativism. So here is a quotation by Ogawa, 1995, where they say that science for him is simply a rational perceiving reality, where perceiving means both the action constructing reality and the construct of reality. And then they say that he says that in any science class, there may be a number of indigenous science, and there will certainly be many personal sciences of learners and teachers. So in this case, if everyone has its own personal science, how can we come to integrate knowledge in a way, for instance, that science teaching becomes possible? So these kinds of views tend in the direction, I think, of philosophical relativism. And the partial overlaps methodology tries to avoid both extremes and provide a more nuanced analysis of the relation between knowledge systems. So on the one hand, we try to learn from optimists and say that, well, it's important to analyze ontological, epistemological, and axiological overlaps that may provide common grounds for different people, heterogeneous stakeholders, to collaborate and to achieve mutual learning. But we can also learn from the pessimists and say that there are indeed substantial differences in ontological, epistemological, and axiological dimensions across knowledge systems, and we need to analyze these differences, which we call the partialities of overlaps. And in particular, we argue for the researcher to take a political position in relation to cultural diversity when they deal with these substantial differences. We, for instance, we take an intercultural attitude, and we take a position for the self-determination of the holders of distant knowledge systems. So we think this political position is particularly crucial when we deal with the partialities of overlaps. So now I will explain this methodology a bit better, but I need to introduce you before to the place where we work, because I will talk about some data from our field work. So we work in this beautiful estuary, very well conserved mangroves areas. That's where we are applying our ideas in transdisciplinary initiatives. So basically we work in Brazil, in the northeast part of Brazil, in the state of Bahia, in a municipality called Conde, and in the Itapicuru River estuary, in particularly in two fishing villages, one called Siribinha and another called Poças. These are artisanal fishers' villages. They are descendants of quilombos. The quilombos were settlements founded by slaves who escaped from the Portuguese rulers, the Portuguese owners, and managed to found these settlements. And so these people in these villages are descendants of people who found these settlements some centuries ago. But they are up to this point, very small villages. Siribinha has only 500 inhabitants. Poça has only 800 inhabitants. And I can show you here a picture of Siribinha. I will not show a picture of Poças for the sake of time, but I can show some interesting aspects here. First, they live in this very beautiful estuary. They have very well conserved mangroves, and they manage the estuary. So for instance, here we see a place in the mangroves that they constantly manage to keep it open for their fishing artifacts and boats. And we can see in this other picture that this village is squeezed between the ocean and the mangroves, between the oceans and the estuary. So this estuary where they live is a very conserved estuarine system. We have been doing conservation biology studies there and identified a number of endangered species who are well and living in these estuaries, but also this estuary harbors a conservative fishing culture, and the fishing cultures of Brazil are slowly disappearing from the shore. So Brazil has 4 fishing cultures, but basically one of it is from the northeast part called Cultura dos Jangadeiros, and all these cultures are a hybrid between Portuguese fishing culture and knowledge and indigenous fishing knowledge. And so they have a lot of knowledge about nets, how to make nets, how to use nets. They have a lot of knowledge of pitfalls, like these pitfalls called covos, how to build them, how to use them. And they have a lot of knowledge about that is embodied in their bodies. So I will show a movie now, if I manage to do it, where if you listen attentively, you see, pay attention to the body of the fisherwoman and how she's whistling to attract the crabs that she will capture. So we are very interested in this kind of embodied knowledge that appears in cases like this. No, I'm not managing to do it. Maybe it is. So you see that she whistles to attract the crabs, and the crabs really come. And there is another fisherwoman you are not seeing. She's beating the branches of the mangroves to attract the crabs. It's both the sound and a scent, they say, that comes out of the leaves and the branches. And here I need to take the sound out. I'll show another movie for you, and if you pay attention, I'm calling attention to the fact that these fishers, as other traditional cultures, often their knowledge is not propositional knowledge. It's not knowledge that. It's a knowledge how, which is embodied in their movements, in their bodies, in the way they do things. So here you can see how they move a boat in Siribim and Poças to get it to the sea. And what they're doing here, if you describe physically what's going on, there are 3 things happening. They make a lever, they change the center of gravity, and they reduce friction with the sand. And in this way, they can move the boat much easier than if they were only pulling the boat towards the sea. And then if I jump a bit to the point here, you see when they enter the sea, and a lot of knowledge is also here involved. So they keep the boat at 45 degrees inclination towards the ocean. This is a very violent ocean. And they need to do that to distribute the forces in the side of the boat. So one of the fishermen, they didn't go up the boat because they need to keep the boat at 45 degrees. Otherwise, the waves might roll the boat over itself. And then there is a point where he will enter the sea. And we ask them, when you know you should enter the sea? They'll tell us, I cannot explain, I can't say, but pay attention and you see. And then we film these hundreds of times and we notice what happens. So the waves are cracking weaker and weaker, weaker and weaker. At some point, it becomes very flattened. Then they go into the sea and they don't need to jump the first waves. And then when they jump the waves, you'll notice that they'll take the rows out of the boat such that the waves don't take the row out of their hands. So they'll jump over the sea waves, always like this, up to a point they pass beyond the crack of the waves. So I think there is something here that we need to pay a lot of attention, because these fishermen are showing a kind of knowledge that we usually devalue from a Western point of view. We value propositional knowledge a lot, and we don't value as much this kind of embodied knowledge. If someone wants to see more about this, can see the ethnographic movie we did with these fishermen and fisherwomen in YouTube. Unfortunately, we still don't have subtitles in Portuguese, but if we put the Pescando Arts, which means fishing arts, you can find the movie there. But I'll move on now to explain a bit more on the overlaps and begin with ontology. So even though anthropological literature produced a lot of information about radical alterity and great divergences in ontology between cultures, particularly indigenous cultures and Western cultures, ethnobiological research has been often documenting to ontological convergence across cultures. So if you look, for instance, at what the Tseltal Maya say about jaguars and what Western zoologists say about jaguars, it's not really controversial that they're referring to the same animal when they talk about jaguars, even though they have very different knowledge about these animals, and they think about the animal they call Balan and Pantera lonca, respectively, in a very different ways. And you can ask how this ontological overlap can happen if they have such different knowledge about jaguars. And we don't need to be committed to very strong natural kinds exploration, thinking that ontologists could cut nature at its joint or something like that to explain this ontological overlap. There is a simpler explanation for the shared commitment to the existence of jaguars, which is the fact that they also recognize, both Western zoologists and Maya recognize shared properties. There is a shared cluster of properties they recognize. For example, a lot of properties related to the spotted fur of the jaguar, but also zoologists know some properties that Maya don't know about, like the size of the genome of the jaguar or the physiological mechanisms operating in the organic systems. And Maya also knows some aspects of the jaguar that zoologists don't know about. For instance, how the droppings of a jaguar allow one to track the animal in the jungle, or the hunting habits of local jaguars populations. So David Ludwig, in a paper by 2016, he shows this by this picture where K is the convergent ontological item. Then we have some properties like R, Q, and P that only Maya recognize, some properties like V, W, and X that only zoologists recognize, and you have the shared cluster properties, S, T, U, that allow both to recognize the same animal. The ontological overlap then happens. Once we have this picture, we can ask, so if we try to integrate the knowledge, for instance, of fishers and fisheries researchers, how can we know it is epistemically productive to do so? How can we know what we gain from knowledge integration? Then we argue for some criteria. First, knowledge integration is productive when integrated knowledge offers a broader description of properties ascribed to a convergent taxonomic item, but also when we increase the number of inferences we can make about this item. And to increase the number of inferences, there are two avenues. One is by summing the unique inferences from each system. We simply sum the traditional knowledge inferences with the Western science inferences, so we get more inferences. But the most important issue is when we integrate knowledge and we become capable of making genuinely novel inferences. And why genuinely novel? Because they depend on premises that were only available in the different systems before integration. So I'll show now some examples from a field work on this ontological overlap and epistemic productive of integrated knowledge. So here you have myself and the anthropologists who work in our team, Pari de Bulletin, interviewing one of the traditional experts we work with in Siribinha, Assis. And then I'll be talking about this animal. It's an endangered hawk, which is called in the villages Gacici, in other places of Brazil, caranguejeiro or gavião do mangue. In English, is the Rufous crab hawk, and for science, is the Butelgallus echinoctialis. And there is a neat convergence between the reference of these terms. So we have a case of ontological convergence. We have inferences on this hawk made from traditional ecological knowledge. So what I'm quoting here is a saying in Siribinha. Gacici sang, the tide turned. In fact, what happens is the fishers, they interact with this hawk. So they say, when this hawk is singing, the tide is turning and you begin to empty. And then they go to the boats and take the fish out of the nets because the fish will be exposed to the atmosphere and will be rotting faster. So they interact with the hawk, listen to the hawk, and that's why they have this saying, Gacici sang, the tide turned, which obviously in inferences. we can make an inference on GACC also from academic ecological knowledge, even though there are only 26 papers published by GACC based on a survey given by Google Scholar. But we can apply general ecological knowledge. So this is a top predator. So the fact that this species has a healthy population estuary is an indicator that the mangroves there are well conserved. So that's an inference from academic ecological knowledge. But then, can we build novel inference for integrating academic and traditional ecological knowledge? Well, we can. And here's a hypothesis we built, and we still need to test it, of why GACC calls with entire terms. So a possible explanation is that this hawk calls to signal to a conspecific with whom it hunts, probably a couple, because hawks usually hunt together as a couple. So one signal to the other the availability of crabs for foraging because the tide is empty. So the only way we can produce this hypothesis is by taking a premise from the traditional ecological knowledge and also knowledge from academic science. And then we need to consider partiality of ontological overlap, which happens in case of lumping, for instance. So here's a case of lumping. I'll explain what lumping is in a minute. So in this estuary, there are two ethnospecies of maçarico. It's a sandpiper in English. So we have the maçarico grande and maçarico pequeno, the small sandpiper and the large sandpiper. But when we look in comparing traditional ecological knowledge and academic ecological knowledge, we see that the small sandpiper and the large sandpiper, they correspond to 11 scientific species. So that's a case of lumping. One ethnospecies captures a number of different scientific species. Can be also in the other way around, but I'll show an example soon. I will not explain now how you have this difference. We can discuss this later if you wish, but I need to move on with the arguments. So what we start asking is, even though we have this partiality of overlap, the relations, the ontological relations are not so simple. Can we still make inferences? And we see that we can make inferences if we think about the genus maçarico at the traditional ecological knowledge, the ethnogenus sandpiper or maçarico. So for instance, here's an inference of sandpipers made by people from traditional ecological knowledge. And all these quotations are data from our interviews, in fact. So they say, if the food of the sandpipers is absent from the estuary, for instance, gagel, it's a small crab, pichitinga is a small shrimps. So if the food is absent, the sandpipers leave the estuary. And then you can take a piece of knowledge from academic knowledge. Sandpipers have a lot of similarity in resource use, so they often suffer character displacement along evolution. And then we put the two pieces together, and we have a novel inference. We know that some sandpiper species stay the whole year in the estuary. Some sandpiper species migrate in the winter. Then we can make this hypothesis. The seasonality of some species, but not others, depends on winter resource scarcity and whether the species is a superior or inferior competitor. And again, I'm taking the traditional ecological knowledge, the academic ecological knowledge, integrating it and building a novel inference. So now we are more systematically applying the partial overlaps methodology in empirical studies in Siribinha. Our doctoral student, Vitor Henk, is doing that. And when he started using the framework empirically in a very systematic way, so he notes that there are two different kinds of partiality in place. One is complementing partiality, the other is competing partialities. So complementing partiality is when one knowledge system has some knowledge that the other doesn't have and vice versa. So it's simple. Competing partiality is the most interesting case because it's the most challenging case for mutual learning, co-production of knowledge, and co-management. That's the case where there are rival descriptions or rival explanations of phenomena. And then we start thinking, well, can we learn when overlaps are merely partial, even competing? And we start thinking about this, and we came to see that if we learn from traditional communities, this can also be a way for them to have a say on policymaking that affects them. So for instance, we have here a case of robalão, which is one ethnospecies in the estuarine system in Siribinha, and for science is Centropomus undecimalis. Here we have the opposite relation. The Centropomus undecimalis, one scientific species, they have two ethnospecies correspond to the scientific species in the estuary. One is robalão, the other is robalo espalmado. They are always nukes. And they say to us, look, This species, robalão, the spawning period in the Itapicuru estuary is from November to February. That's when it's reproducing. But there is a closed period for this species. It's protected. But the closed period is from May to July. And so the fishermen make fun about this. So look, we can take it when it's reproducing. And when it's not reproducing, we cannot take it. And then think if we use fishers' knowledge to revise the laws. And there is a good reason to do that, because the laws in Brazil for that were established based on a single study that was generalized over the whole shore of Brazil. And there is a lot of variation in spawning period depending on local conditions. And the fishers, well, they know when the animal is spawning because they get the animals with the eggs. So we can revise the laws based on fisher's knowledge. It's simply better than academic knowledge in this case, at least at this state of knowledge. And if we can do that, then knowledge integration can play for the fishing communities and other traditional communities an empowering role that contributes to their own self-determination. They can affect the laws that affect their lives. So that's it for ontological overlaps. We can come back to this in this discussion if we wish. Now let's look at overlaps in epistemology. Here I'm showing Mário Sérgio Nego, which is one of the greatest traditional experts we interact with in Siribinha. And we began to do this study based on David Ludwig and Luana Polizelli's work in biology and philosophy, where they argue that we should go beyond the divide between traditional academic ecological knowledge and start doing more nuanced analysis, looking for similar and different heuristic tools that traditional communities and academic science use. Then I built a set of interviews to go to the field and try to discover some of these heuristic tools. So that these interviews were based on scenarios. So I'll take a phenomenon that they described to us before in interviews, and I'll ask them to explain the phenomenon. So the first phenomenon is this one. So we have this bivalve, that's a bit ontological convergence, that's Massunin as an ethno species, for scientific species, Anomalocardia brasiliana. And this bivalve has a cycle in the estuary. It appears and disappears, it appears and disappears. And then I asked them why this happened. And they gave me the following explanation. I can detail the methods if you wish in the discussion, but I'll not detail the methods now. So that's the summary of the explanation they give to us. Well, what happens is when it's raining upstream in the river, you have all this fresh water coming into the estuary. And this animal, he likes salt. He doesn't like fresh water. It is affected by salt. So what happens is when the fresh water comes, it kills all these animals. That's why it disappears. But then obviously you need to ask about how it appears back again. They say, well, it appears because some of them are buried in the mud and they keep buried there, sensing, probing the water to see, to use their words, if the seawater washed away the fresh water. So when the seawater washes away the fresh water, then the Massunin notes, he's probing the environment, he notes that, well, now the salt's great. He goes up again and it appears again. Then we have a fisheries researcher working our team. We asked him, what do you think about this explanation? He said, it's a perfectly plausible explanation. I think it's probably what happens. So we have causal explanation is a heuristic tool that is used both by academic scientists and by traditional people. They do causal explanation. And then we start probing a bit more. So if we take the minimal account of mechanism, which is proposed by Hillary and John Williamson, based on the idea that mechanisms are sets of entities and activities organized in such a way that they are responsible for a phenomenon. Could they have mechanistic explanations? So there is another scenario we presented to them. That's the explanation of a phenomenon they call the robalo waters. That's times of the year when you have a lot of snook in the estuarine waters, so much snook that they don't fish anything else. They only fish snooks. And we discover when interviewing several of the fishermen and fisherwomen that they have something that we can interpret. For them, it's not a mechanistic explanation for sure, but we can interpret as a kind of mechanistic explanation based on this minimal account of mechanism. So here is the explanation for the robalo water. Note there is a system with several entities, several activities, several relations, and alternative causal pathways that lead to the same phenomenon. The green arrows are facilitating relations, the red arrows are inhibitory relations. So they explain to us, when you have freshwater inflow, the same one that kills Massunin, They know that the snooks, they reproduce in the mangroves. They know that. And they are there, the juveniles are there in the mangroves. And then when the fresh water comes, they are displaced from their mangrove shelters and they start migrating into the ocean. Well, that's one cause of the robalo water. But also, they tell us more. They tell us, look, in this estuary, we have a phenomenon called the burning waters. What's the burning waters? It's bioluminescence. They say that's the nets that keep sparkling. And in fact, in this estuary, many times in the year, when you put your hand in the water shines. So we have all these sparkles in the nets. And what happens is that the jellyfish bioluminescence, as they describe it, the burning waters, make fishes detect the fishing nets. And it's awful to fish. They give up fishing when you have burning waters. But when this fresh water is coming, it's a muddy water, full of sediment. So what happens is that the fish cannot detect the nets anymore because the water is muddy. They can't see the nets sparkling. So that's another cause of robalo water. But they also say, look, sometimes we don't have muddy waters, but it's good for fishing because we have a full moon. And we have a full moon, such light from the moon that the fish cannot see the bioluminescence, and then we fish well. So it's robalo water again. And also, when you have a big tide, the robalos will reproduce in the mangroves. They will be entering the estuary, and we have robalo water again. So robalo water can happen based on different causes, different causal pathways. So we think this is a mechanistic explanation, and just as scientists use a mechanistic explanation, fishers may be using a mechanistic explanation too. But again, we should pay attention to the partiality of overlaps. So there are different heuristic tools also used by traditional knowledge and academic knowledge. For instance, they often recognize macro regularities that don't provide a causal explanation. So in another scenario, we ask, why does he see things when the tide is turning? And they say, well, we don't know. They just know the macro regularity. They don't explain. Well, our job is to explain the world. Their job is to fish. They don't want to explain everything. They explain some things. They don't explain other things. It's a very nice research question to understand why some things are explained, why some things are not explained. And also they use some kinds of explanations we don't use in science anymore. So for instance, they have essentialist explanation. When we ask them why robalão comes to the estuary to reproduce, they say, well, because the river is the natural place of the robalão, is the place where it should be. So that's an essentialist explanation we don't use anymore. They keep using. But then we need to ask, what about radical alterity? All these cases look relatively simple when you think about the complicated case that anthropologists talk about to us, like shamanic transformation, things like this. Can we extend the idea of partial overlaps to radical alterity? So let's take an example. The study by Edward Cohn on the rune of Ecuador Upper Amazon, where he describes that for them, the forest is a thinking agent. Despite the discussion on plant cognition, plant intelligence, I think we still don't consider in Western ideas forest to be thinking. I don't think there is a convergence of Western ideas on cognitive systems. But still, could it be an overlap? Well, at least part of the Westerners will find the idea of thinking forest absolutely fascinating. So it seems that there is at least enough ontological overlap for thinking forest to be intelligible to us such that we get fascinated. So even though it's a radical alterity case, there is still overlap going on there. This is not to deny limits in ontological overlap. There are deep transcultural differences, but doesn't seem to be here a fully fledged incommensurability because it is intelligible to us what is a thinking forest. And I can come now from my favorite radical alterity example, with the caipora. The caipora is an entity that exists in several indigenous cultures, in Amerindian indigenous cultures, and is also the fishing cultures because part of the knowledge came from the indigenous community. And what these cultures tell us about the caipora? The caipora is a protector of the forest. And what happens is if you do something really wrong in the forest, for instance, a fisherman will tell us, if you go to a red mangrove tree and you cut the bark too much and you kill the tree, be attentive. Next time you go to the mangroves, the caipora will make you be lost. What he'll do, he'll pretend to be your parent, your father, your mother, your uncle, and will keep you lost in the mangroves for weeks, up to a point where he gives up on you and you can leave the mangroves. And the Amerindian cultures will tell, look, why we hunt? We hunt because Kaipora gives us the animal. They don't have any explanation like we are the big hunters, the big guy who can hunt. No, the Kaipora gives us the animal. But for the Kaipora to give you the animal, he should have forest. If you don't allow it to have enough forest, if you cut the forest, then you never hunt again because the Kaipora doesn't have enough animals to give you the animals. The Brazilian anthropologist Mauro Almeida even says in a paper that Kaipora is like a protected area based on the Amerindian culture. So there is no convergence between Kaipora and any category in Western ontology, and an academic might be tempted to ask, does Kaipora exist? And then suppose we say no. No, Kaipora does not exist. From our ontological perspective, there is no Kaipora. Well, what happened? What happened is only a power relation. We again imposed our ontology on the ontology of those people. And the road for further inquiry and further learning is simply blocked. So for me, this is a kind of unfruitful questions that should be dismissed. And we should ask more intelligent questions than this. So we can ask, if we look at how Kaipora regulates the human-nature relations by a complex interplay of ontology, values, and epistemology, we might be asking something different. We might be asking, what can we learn from taking Kaipora seriously? What is it like to believe Kaiporas to exist? And then we have a road open for further inquiry and learning. We can ask further things. For instance, what might we do differently in our societies if we believed in Kaiporas? And so I think I'm very interested now in understanding this kind of thing. How can we learn from radical alterity? And we have been investigating this issue using the ideas of intercultural empathy and cultural equivocation. Because of time, I'll do only some sketches of the arguments. I hope it is understandable. So one of our starting points is empathy, intercultural empathy. And we take as one base for that the work by Bennett, 1979, where he says that empathy is the imaginative, intellectual, and emotional participation in another person's experience. So he brings this idea of participatory empathy. Empathy is not trying to see the world with the eyes of other people. It's not about suffering the suffer of others. It's about participating in the experience of others. And so this work by Bennett paved the way to what has been called a situated or relational conception of empathy. So this idea says that empathy takes place in the domain of shared understanding through shared experience. And Kastner brings a very interesting argument saying that if you have an individual for culture A, an individual for culture B, the individual for culture A cannot see the world with the eyes of the individual of culture B and vice versa. But if they participate together in a shared experience, they build together a third culture and they reach empathy emerging in this third culture where they say together something that's not original, which either one of them were saying. So that's a very interesting idea, which Broom formulates as what he calls meaning productive relational empathy. It is relational because it's only in participation experience of one another, not only intellectually, but affectively, that we can find intercultural empathy, and it's meaning productive because the empathy is about producing new meanings by experiencing something together. And then this, I think this is really important because it allows coexistence and co-learning despite radical alterity. And then if I now combine this with the work of Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, I think we can go a bit further on this. So Viveiros de Castro will argue that a good intercultural translation is one that allows others' concepts to deform and subvert the translator conceptual toolbox, our own concepts. So I do a good translation of Kaipora when I allow the Kaipora's ideas about Kaipora to deform and subvert my own conceptual toolbox. And so Viveiros de Castro talks about intercultural translations control the equivocation that generates productive misunderstanding. What's this? So we can begin with the feeling that we can translate the ideas of others into our ideas. And then equivocation is good because it shows that you cannot. But even if you cannot translate the ideas of others in your own ideas, you can, by trying to do so, generate a misunderstanding which is productive. And so Viveiros de Castro will argue that when you translate, then we situate ourselves in the space of equivocation and we dwell there. And he says that's important because we recognize difference. But then if I put the two things together, the meaning productive relation empathy, controlled equivocation, and the partial overlaps, perhaps considering experiential participation, we may pave a way for going beyond just dwelling in the space of equivocation. If we think that, if we share each other's experience, perhaps we could talk together about a novel, emergent, third perspective. From this perspective, the other of the others is always other, and neither we nor they are saying what we are saying before. But what novel things may we be saying together when we deform and subvert each other? So I think this is an important question, and I keep asking questions based on this. So for instance, what change will happen in our perspective if we allow indigenous views of the Caipora to deform or subvert it? What difference will be produced and what indifference will be overcome when we translate Caipora for controlled equivocation and allow ourselves to be subverted? What happens if Caipora subvert our demotion of himself to metaphor and challenges our literalist interpretation of our Western ontology as what things out there really are? We may become pregnant of transformative question if we keep following with this thinking. We can ask what's like to believe in Caiporas or see a world where there are Caiporas, what word is expressed through Caiporas, or of what word Caiporas are the point of view. And we might be pondering about the word of which Caipora the point of view. How would we subvert our perspective of our own developed word? How precious could this subversion be in our current devastated and diseased world? Perhaps we would be more attentive to what indigenous leaders like Ailton Krenak and David Kopenhauer keep telling us, or perhaps we might act instead of just listening. So I'll not say much more on this, and I'll move to overlapping value system, because I think when we start talking about these things and start valuing what changes Caiporas or ancestor jaguars or other indigenous entities could bring to our relation to nature, we found in overlapping value systems there is value convergence despite radical alterity. But again, we should be attentive to partiality, because we may start thinking about sustainability when we ponder about the consequence of Caipora. But sustainability is our concept, is a Western notion that differs from indigenous communities' values. Sustainability is quite close to the concept of development, which makes no sense for indigenous communities. In fact, they're not talking about sustainability. They are talking about a moral order in which there should be the right kind of balance between humans, nature, and other than humans, like ancestral jaguars, Caiporas, and other entities. So I'd like to finish now to come to the last part, posing another question we have been asking in our research. I talked a lot about knowledge integration, but then we need to ask who decides and how to decide whether one or another knowledge system should be used, or whether knowledge integration should take place. And this question, which I have been investigating here in Coimbra with Boaventura de Souza Santos, brings us to issues of power and issues of criteria to decide which knowledge system to use. So I'll give you some hints on how we handle these kind of things by considering again our field experience. So in the place where we work, the fishers communities themselves implanted tourism in the 90s, like almost 30 years ago. And this is a small scale tourism which has environmental and social impacts, but it's small scale. These impacts are not very high and the environment is still conserved. And then 20 years later, just now, like some years ago, the local authorities, particularly the municipality, they intervene in this situation and decide to organize tourism, make tourism more sustainable, and build a mosaic of protected areas in this estuary. We began working there in 2016, and we started doing studies on fishers' biological knowledge, and also we started doing educational research in collaboration with the local teachers to develop and test in the classroom educational innovations to bring the fishermen and their knowledge into the classroom, into the curricula, thinking of the classroom and the curricula as a locus of power. And we also start doing ecological and conservation research And when we discovered this amazingly conserved estuary, we engaged in participatory planning for conservation with the local communities. I cannot tell the story now, but we ended up in a situation where we are mediating between the municipality and the communities. And this is a big team, like 21 senior, 19 junior researchers doing all these things there. So what's going on in this place now is that a mosaic of protected areas in ecomuseum is being planned, and one protected area was already created. The municipality was using a top-down approach, and we managed to move this into a bottom-up approach with local participation, decision management. There is planning going on such that these protected areas in the ecomuseum generate income for the local communities, that they can keep the ownership of the tourism facilities that they built along these years, and that traditional knowledge is integrated in management plans and into risk information. But if you look at the conservation sustainability issues, it is a very conflicting situation. It's very complicated. So using a scheme by Roberts, 2000, I'll try to explain why it is so complicated. We face there a wicked problem in the sense that there is conflict not only about solutions to the problem, there are conflict about what's really the problem. And the communities who live in this place, they have dispersed power. They don't have leaders. They have powers very dispersed along several social actors there, which means that there are no authoritative strategies in place. We start doing participatory planning to build authoritative strategies by promoting social negotiation among the people in the communities. And also there is a contestation of power there. The only power that's not contested there is the university. The municipality likes us, communities likes us, but the communities don't like the municipality. And they don't like the local leaderships too. So there are no power except the university, which is not contested. And there is a problem of phasing out between the local power conservation tourism plan and the community power. The community empowerment takes a long time. The local power can make their plan to do conservation, organized tourism to go much faster than community empowerment. And this leads us to a very dangerous situation, a risky situation. And what we're trying to do, as there is power contested everywhere, there are no collaborative strategies, and we're trying to build social negotiation to construct these collaborative strategies. This is far from successful, but it is advancing. And if I look at the work in conservation, the most important outcomes we have up to now is that we are doing the first steps in community organization. For instance, they have been collecting garbage in the estuary collectively as an idea they brought themselves to face what they think it is a major problem for the community, with lack of union. They said we can become more united if we do things together, and they start doing these garbage collection campaigns. And we also managed to turn, up to now, a top-down conservation planning into a bottom-up process, which I think was a very important outcome of our work there. And I'll finish by looking at the schools where there's a less contested situation, and our approach can better work there at this point. So what we do to build a transdisciplinary approach there is to build a community of prats. I cannot elaborate much on what a community of prats is, but it is a group of humans which derives their cohesion from a shared prats. And as there is this shared prats, these humans become mutually engaged with each other, they become mutually responsible for each other, and they build then a shared enterprise. They do something together which makes them recognize themselves as a community. And by doing something together, they build a shared repertoire of knowledge, of attitudes, of values, of practices, which is the repertoire of the community. And then, in this community of practice, learning happens through participation as a kind of situated learning. What happens is, if you become a member of the community, you get a legitimate participation in the community, which means that you can access the repertoire of knowledge, values, practices, etc. But at that point, even though your participation is legitimate, it is peripheral. In what sense? In the sense that at that moment in history, the community mastered the practice in a way you don't master. You are a novice. But as you have access to the repertoire, you can increasingly master the repertoire up to a point you can have a central participation in the sense that now you can do the practice in as good way as the community can. But if you look at the community of practice we are building there, it is a special one because there are two communities of practice that are merging together, and there is a new community of practice that is emerging from participation and shared experience. So on the one hand, we have the community of practice of the teachers, the local teachers, where we are the novices, the researchers are the novices, and the teachers are the experts. And we have the community of practice of the educational researchers, where we are the experts and the teachers are novices. Which means that all of us, we are all novices and experts at the same time. And this doesn't mean that the vertical and hierarchical relations disappear or power disappears, but at least there is a condition for a more horizontal relation between the participants, which is very important. I would say it is key for mutual learning and co-learning. So if we look at what's going on there, we can see how this is working. We use a lot of frameworks to analyze this knowledge co-production experience we have. I only show a small piece of one of the framework, which is a question when the stakeholders who are not academics are participating in the process, particularly the teachers. So first they have the problem history. They know the history of education there, of the relation between school knowledge and traditional knowledge, and we don't know. They help us in identifying the problem. We decide together what we will tackle in the classroom, what we try to do. They build the research methodology with us. They participate in the data collection. They participate in the data analysis. They are authors with us in the papers. They are not acknowledgements. They are authors. And they are implementing the innovation together with us. And there is negotiation of goals happening all the time along this process. And in fact, if you look at what we have done now, up to now, we are trying with education innovation to deal with 3 goals. 2 of these goals were defined by the local teachers. 1 was defined by us. We defined the goal of bringing the traditional knowledge into the classroom as a locus of power. The teachers brought the 2 other goals to build up the self-esteem of the children in the school as sons and daughters of fishermen and fisherwomen, and they brought the other goal of making integration with the school curricula so that they could learn from experience that are more familiar to them. So it seems the negotiation of goals is really going on. So we also use the partial overlaps methodology in this study in the local schools. So one thing we are doing now, and we are interrupted by COVID, but we are building an ethnobotanical garden in one of the schools, which is both for the school, for the community, and for the tourists. And this is based on our work on the traditional ethnobotanical knowledge, where we have been cataloging and understand the plants they use as medicines, for fishing artifacts, for construction. And we are working with the students in analyze the overlaps and non-overlaps between school science and traditional knowledge to put this information to the garden information, particularly for the tourists who pass through this village and don't notice that they are stepping over a place where there is a lot of knowledge they are ignoring. So using this methodological approach, then, we are trying to build transdisciplinary efforts to work in contested situations, but putting academic and non-academic knowledge in relation, and use these communities of practices as tools for building transdisciplinary collaboration and to foster co-learning, knowledge co-production, knowledge integration. Certainly, the construction of transdisciplinary research for socio-environmental transformation is a utopia, is very challenging, is possibly unlikely in our unequal and polarized society torn by conflicts and domination relationships. But I would say that utopias are precious regulatory ideals we should keep with us, because what's good about utopia is not to reach it, but is that they guide our steps towards what we think is what the world should be. And then one question we keep asking while we are in the field dealing with all the complicated situations we deal with is what steps, little as they are, can we take in the direction of our utopias at the scale of our possible action? Thank you very much. I don't know about time.
Thank you very much, Charbel. This was just fantastic. I guess it's really a masterclass in how to think about, some serious conceptual, a number of huge conceptual challenges in a way that is both philosophically, historically informed and deeply engaged and informed by very serious work over many years on what it means to actually engage different communities in building knowledge. So this was just fantastic for us. Now we're gonna stop the recording at this point of the seminar. And if you want to listen to this talk again, which of course